Today's scripture comes from the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, verses 7 through 13. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. This is the word of the Lord.
Happy Mother's Day. And in a culture where increasingly, motherhood is not valued, you certainly, moms, all of you who are moms who work really hard at that, deserve a really good day to be honored. But please pardon me, today I did not choose to have a Mother's Day sermon. I want us to stay on track through this series called Beautiful Justice. And you may notice the text is not in the book of Ruth, because I thought this would be a good time to take a slight shift to answer a very important question before we get to the latter portion of the book of Ruth. And that question is, why do we keep following certain laws from the Old Testament but not others? That's really what I want to talk about today. Because I've taught you that God cares very much, very seriously about restorative justice, and specifically that we would love, protect, and care for three classes of people: the widow, the fatherless, and the vulnerable minority, which our translation calls the sojourners. And it's so serious that he threatens his people that if you don't do this, there will be very, very serious consequences, and that is a repeated theme throughout the Old Testament. And in this book of Ruth, we've had particularly two practices that we in the modern world aren't familiar with. One is gleaning, which is that in those times back then, you're not supposed to pick up all your harvest all the way to the edge of the field. Some are supposed to be left for these vulnerable, poor persons in their midst. And the other practice, which we talked about last week, which is this practice of the kinsman redeemer. It's also related to something called the levirate marriage, and it's very, very strange to our modern ears, because it is about if a man dies, then his brother is supposed to have a child and marry. He's supposed to marry his sister-in-law and have a child, which will then carry on his namesake and provide for the widow. So obviously that's not something we do today. This thing that was called the levirate marriage, and in the book of Ruth, it's related. It's not exactly the same. It's called the kinsman redeemer. And I taught you all about this last week. And some of you are going, well, we don't do that anymore. So what exactly does that mean for how we are supposed to understand the Old Testament, and how we understand which laws we follow and which we no longer follow? And so that's the purpose of today's message. It's actually quite important. And what I find is that in the last, this was actually taught to me when I was in college, but in the last couple generations, most Christians don't seem to have this understanding in the Bible, and this understanding I teach you is from the Bible. It's not like Christians came along, imposed some idea on the Bible. They learned this principle from the Bible. And so I hope this will be very helpful to you. And then with this really important piece of theology, that you will have a deeper understanding of how to read and understand the Bible, and how the Old Testament and the Old Covenant relates to the New Testament and the New Covenant, okay? So, and if you don't understand anything, some of what I just said, just hang on, okay? And I told you a secondary reason why we're going through the book of Ruth is not just to understand the beautiful things that are in Ruth and God's insistence upon his vision of justice, but it's also to help you to read the Bible well, okay? And so that's why this message, I hope, will be, I think it's going to be particularly crucial and will shed light when we go to the latter portion of the book of Ruth. All right. With that said, let's get at it. Part 1. The new covenant reshaping the law of God. Okay? The new covenant reshaping the law of God. Part 2. Moral, ceremonial, and judicial laws. There are distinctions in God's laws. And you're going to see that it's important to have those distinctions. Okay? And part 3, Christ's fulfillment once for all. Let's go to part 1, the new covenant reshaping the law of God. Let's get right into the text. So Hebrews chapter 8, this is taught in multiple different places. I chose this particular passage because you have to have a fundamental understanding how essentially in the Bible there's an old covenant and then there's a new. We're living inside the new. And it has deep implications for how we think about God's laws. So let's get into it. Verse 7. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. So let me just start here. The book of Hebrews, it's in the New Testament, and it's intended to talk to Hebrews, obviously. So what we're talking about is people who are ethnically Jewish, who have all of the traditions of the Old Testament, and all their life they were taught to follow the Mosaic law. So what we're talking about the first covenant here, is basically the Mosaic law. That is the laws that govern throughout much of the Old Testament. And so this book of Hebrews is particularly crucial to understand this the way the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, the way the whole Bible coheres together. I'll just say, I don't want to get too much into the weeds with this, but if you are Jewish and listening to this message, or you have friends who are Jewish, this is a crucial place where Jews and Christians disagree on how to read the Bible and really how to understand God and salvation. And before I just want to say this. There are certain Jews who think that these other people came along, they invented this so-called new religion and called Christianity, and then they imposed this on the Bible. And that is so far from the truth. That is so wrong. This comes out of, as you're going to see, out of the Old Testament, which is their Bible, which the Jews don't call it the Old Testament. They call it the Hebrew Scriptures, or actually they call it Tanakh, which is literally means for the three parts of the Old Testament: Torah, Nevi'im. Torah means the law and the covenants. Nevi'im means the prophets, and K means the writings, Ketubim, so it's T-N-K. They call it Tanakh, right? But if you read the Tanakh, which we call the Old Testament, what you'll see is what is happening with their covenant is unfulfilled, and their promises, prophetic promises, that God is going to do something new to their covenant, and that hasn't been fulfilled in the Old Testament. So when the Jews who say that the Christians made something up and that the New Testament is illegitimate, that's absolutely wrong. It's not something that was on the outside imposed in. It's in their Bible, which is our Bible. You get it? You're following me? It's absolutely out of the Bible. It's from God. So here's the case. So there was a first covenant. If it had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. Verse 8. For he finds fault with them when he says, this is God, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So, some of you are like, okay, this sounds all interesting, but what is a covenant? Now, some of you, if you've been pastored by me for now, I hope you know what a covenant is. And we talked a little bit about it here when we were going through the confirmation for our sister Grace. Okay, but let me make it very explicit. What is a covenant? A covenant is when two parties we're talking two, and they're not one, become joined as one under God. You hearing me? Two parties, they were apart, then they are bound together and become united as one under God. So in a covenant, there's always three parts. There's God, and then there's the two that are joined together. You following me? And so as soon as I say this, you're going to think that kind of sounds like a marriage. Exactly. A marriage is covenantal. In the modern day world, since people don't want God or don't believe in God, increasingly in our modern secular age, marriage is seen as contractual. A contract is not a covenant. A contract is like two people get together and says, I'll do this for you and you do this for me. And that is still good as long as, we keep the contract. But as soon as I don't want the contract anymore, I'll break it, right? And in the ancient world, people realized, let me tell you who, people realized that if there was a more powerful party in the covenant, so let's say this person is rich, but this person's poor, or let's use a different place where our covenant was done. Let's say a powerful nation conquered a weaker nation. So what will typically happen? The weaker nation hates the more powerful nation and then will rebel and then regularly become terrorists, as the more stronger party would call it, and there'll be continuous violence. There will not be peace. We know this is how it works all throughout the world. It's the way it's always been. So what could happen is there would be a covenant. A covenant would be made so that these two who were at war and hated each other, and these people were like, well, we can never trust you because you killed our people and you conquered us and we think you're oppressors. What they would do is they would say, we make promises, we will not do this for you. Indeed, we will bless you. And then the two can become one. And this is what's important about a covenant. It has to be under God, and it's especially important that the more powerful party puts themselves under curse. So today, we have two parties. They have contract, and whoever has the better lawyers wins. And if they can buy off the government, then they win. That's how contracts tend to happen in an evil world. Those who have more power tend to just squash the contract, corrupt the contract, and then make the weaker party more downtrodden. God hates this. This is called oppression. And when people operate in this way, basically God said He's going to burn that people down. But in a covenant, you come under God. And if one of the parties refuses to fulfill their portion of the covenant to bless and unite to the other, then they incur curse from God. You following me? Now here's what's incredible about the Bible teaches, and only the Bible teaches this. No other worldview, no other religion teaches this. You only get this in the Bible, which is that God Himself said, well, I want to love you. You are apart from me. In fact, you are rebellious against me, but I want to be united to you. Indeed, I want to be covenanted to you. And the Bible calls it, I want to be married to you. So God comes into history. He is judge, utterly righteous. He comes into history and He becomes one of the two parties. You see it? So God says, I will covenant myself to you, my people. And then they become one. And they both have obligations of blessing to each other. God too. God incurs obligation to Himself. And then, so you have God as judge, God as the covenant partner, or let's call Him the husband, and Israel, His people, as His bride. And if God as husband fails, then God as judge actually has to curse Himself. That's how covenant works in the Old Testament. Now I'm going to just say one or two more things about this before I move on. Nobody else teaches this. In fact, Muslims think this is really offensive. Because if God would lower Himself and obligate Himself to other people and then be under his own, possibly His own curse, they would say that would be like making God too low. They consider that an insult to God and an offense against their doctrine of God. Therefore, this whole notion of covenant, that they can't accept it. It's an absolutely fundamental division between Muslims and Christians and Jews. Christians and Jews both agree on this, and it's all out of the Bible. Okay, so are you following me now? Tremendously important how the relationship between God and His people goes. And the first covenant He offered it through Moses. So this is what we're talking about here, okay? And there's all kinds of various laws. And some of these laws that I taught you about as we walked through the book of Ruth, they're part of the first covenant, the Mosaic covenant. Following me? So, he says, I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. At this time, Israel had split into two factions. They went into civil war. There were the kings of Judah and there were the kings of Israel. So he's saying, even though you've already split apart and are at war with each other, I will make a new covenant with all of Israel. Verse 9. But it's not like the covenant I made with their fathers. That's their first covenant. On the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant. And so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. In that first covenant, if they would violate justice, for instance, they would be downtrodden, they would oppress the widow and the fatherless and the vulnerable minority, God promised that He would curse them. And ultimately, that's what ends up happening to Israel. They continually become idolaters of other people's gods. They then start to reshape the name of Yahweh to the way that they think is good for themselves. And then they start doing wicked things to the weak and downtrodden in their society. And thus, God says, this covenant thing isn't working. You're really becoming wicked. Verse 10. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And you know where this comes from? The New Testament didn't invent this. This comes right out of the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31. In fact, that promise comes from God through the prophets in the ancient Israel time, when they were quite being wicked, and when God repeatedly kept warning them and calling them back to repentance. But then He said, this isn't going to work. You're going to really need to earn all of the wrath of the curse of the covenant, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a new covenant. Instead of there just being these laws on the outside, I'm going to do something new where I'll put my laws on their minds and on their hearts. So this is why I want to just say a little something about this. Why, if you're a Christian and you see some strange law in the Old Testament and you think, well, we don't do that today, and I guess we don't have to do that today. Not true. If we really are now united to God through His new covenant, through the one who is greater than Moses, that is Jesus, His laws will be on our hearts. And His ways will be on our hearts, on our minds, and we should want to follow them more, not less. Because it's not just a set of laws on the outside, they are on the inside. And they reshape us because our identity and our destiny and all the grace and riches we have received through this new covenant. And then I just want to highlight this in the blue. I will be their God, and they will be my people. You know what that is? That's marriage language. That's covenant language. It's like saying, I will be their husband, and they will be my bride. When you get to the end of the Bible, this language comes up again. That when all of history is over and God heals all things and removes all injustice and all sin and death and every tear, you know what will be declared? I will be their God. And you will be my people. And we'll be utterly united. Kind of sounds like a happily ever ending like love story, doesn't it? It is. You know why? Because that's the Bible story. The Bible's ultimate story is that it is an ultimate love story. That God will go and get a wayward people, and he will fulfill covenant. We could not fulfill it, so he came up with a new covenant, and he promised it. Verse 11, and they shall not teach each other, each one his neighbor, and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me. They will know me. From the least of them to the greatest. From the least of them to the greatest. If you think that we can be Christians and not have concern for the least of them, it's all throughout the Old Testament, and it's absolutely, it'll be forever and ever. The New Covenant says they will absolutely be, the least of them will utterly be dignified and honored and exalted to be alongside of Jesus through all that he has done for us. Okay? Let's finish up. Verse 12. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I'll remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one, and that's a big word here, obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Try to imagine you were Jewish back then, and this book of Hebrews came out. And there is this person that people are saying is the Messiah. He's greater than Moses. And all these practices and laws that you have followed for tons of, just like thousands of years, are now saying it's over. And something new has come. Just imagine how Jews would have reacted to that. Well, they didn't like it. In fact, they so didn't like it that they decided to try to murder some of the preachers who taught this, including the first apostles. So the first apostles, they weren't just being attacked by Greco-Romans, they were being attacked by Jews because of teachings like this. But you know what? It goes on and on and on. There is a law, and because of this new covenant, it now reshapes the laws and has big implications for how we think about God's laws. And I want to get you to that core thing today through this first understanding of covenant. You have to understand the theology of covenant, and then from the theology of covenant, now I can explain to you what happens to the laws, okay? Let's go there. Part 2. Moral, ceremonial, and judicial laws. So when you hear of all these different laws in the Old Testament, in the Bible, I want you to have a distinction in your mind. They're not just all like the Jews. They actually counted all the different commandments and laws, and they actually have a number. They said there are 613. Every Jew is supposed to obey all of them. 613. Does that sound easy to you? We can't even do the Big Ten, the 10 Commandments, but they have 613. And for them, all of them are supposed to be obeyed. But actually, because of the new covenant, there are distinctions, and some of those laws now don't count because the first covenant has now been made obsolete. And what I want to do is teach you the distinction that the Christian theologians in studying the Bible have made and have seen is coming out of the Bible, and this is incredibly helpful for how to understand the Bible. And let me just apply it to you. I'm applying it to this issue of the kinsman redeemer. So, I taught you this thing, said a widow, her brother-in-law is supposed to marry her, and I said, hold on there, everybody, don't go out there and apply the Bible, okay? Because, we don't do this anymore, and I'm giving you this message to try to explain to you why we don't do this anymore, but the underlying moral vision we still follow. The practice of the way the brother-in-law would marry his widow sister-in-law, we don't follow, but the underlying principle of justice we do follow. So, let me give it to you it's right out of our doctrinal standard. So this is from the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 19. So let's go there. So the Westminster Confession of Faith is one of the most brilliant pieces of theological learning that was tied together to give you a core understanding of biblical theology. It's been so good. It was brought together by the best theological minds in the 1600s that many, many denominations still adhere to it, including ours. So our denomination, the Presbyterian Church in America, this is our approach to the Bible on this question. In chapter 19 is about the laws of God. And here's what it says. Chapter 19, part 3. Because this law, commonly called moral, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel. So, what's the moral law? The first two parts, number 1 and 2, is talking about the moral law. And you know what the moral law is? It goes right back to Adam and Eve. Here is a command, and if you're on this side of it, you violate the moral law against me. And we have a name for that. We call that sin. Right? And moral law is for all people at all times, at all places. So it's the first distinction, the moral law. Commonly called the moral law, besides the moral law, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel as a church underage ceremonial laws. So there's another one. The ceremonial laws containing several typical ordinances, partly of worship, which prefigures Christ. So they had all these things about the temple. You'll do the temple this way. There'll be a high priest. He'll put on certain garments. He'll do certain kind of washing exercise. You know what all that does? It points toward Christ. Called the ceremonial laws. Partly of worship prefiguring Christ, His graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and in some of them, partly holding forth diverse, I know diverse, that's the way they used to spell the word diverse, all right? Diverse or various instructions of moral duties. So even inside of the ceremonial laws, some of them we don't do anymore, but some of them also has moral principles in them. Okay, that's important. I'll just get to that in a moment. Next slide. All which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. We don't do the ceremonial laws. Okay? So, just an example. Did you know that Jews are supposed to wash in certain kinds of ways? You know they're not supposed to eat with Gentiles? Well, it's explicitly ordered, Peter, you don't do those things anymore. We're not going to follow those laws anymore. In fact, eat with Gentiles and go love them. Because now the new covenant is for them. So it's just one famous example. Now, I want to just, before I move on to the next point, I just want to say, well, let me say this next point, and then I want to make this point. Part 4, chapter 19, part 4. To them also, as a body politic, He, that is God, gave sundry is an old word that just means various. He gave various judicial laws. So we've had ceremonial laws, and now we have judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people. So the judicial laws are like the civil laws, the laws of the governance. And the government of the time under Moses was a theocracy. And so when God allowed that government to be gone, those judicial laws also expired, not obliging any other now further than the general equity thereof may require. That means there's certain kinds of fundamental pieces of equity and fairness, but besides that, we don't do these judicial laws. Okay? So number 1, we had the ceremonial laws, and now they've been made obsolete. And now we have the judicial laws of the governance that also has now expired. Let's go to part 5. But the moral law doth forever bind all. That's the part I want you to get today. The moral law doth forever bind all, as well justified persons as others. So that's language saying, if you are a person who believes in Jesus Christ, you're justified of your sins. It applies to the Christian and the non-Christian. The moral law is on everybody for all time. And that not only in regard of the matter contained in it, so whatever the law it is about the morality, let's just say don't commit adultery. We'll just choose that one, right? It's not only about just that, but also in respect of the authority of God, the Creator who gave it. So you know what this is saying? All of God's laws, His moral law, it's always covenantal. We're always under Him. So God is our judge. He became the church's husband, His people's husband. And now when we obey the moral law, it's not just like, well, the rule says so. That's what the law says. And so there are a lot of people who tend to think, I'm a good person because I follow the rules. But they never think about those laws are a reflection of God the Creator. You know why? We don't just follow arbitrary rules in Christianity. Christianity is a very sensible, very ordered, and very reasoned faith. It is not arbitrary. God doesn't just simply say, I have this rule, and make sure you're on the side of it. Here's a line. You cross this line, and because I'm God, I'll get you. Sometimes that's how parents react to their kids, like, don't do this. And when kids ask, why not? Sometimes I've heard some parents just say, because I said so. Well, that's true. They should follow your authority, but it would be good in general that I think you don't have arbitrary lines to your children. God never has arbitrary lines. And His moral laws are a reflection of Himself, of His very character, and justice is an attribute of His very character. And so the moral laws, justice is actually, it's a subset of God's character. So justice will never, ever go away, and justice will never change, because God's not going to change. Muslims actually believe that God's almightiness, His power, is more important than His righteousness. So that God's almighty power is so tremendous that if He wanted to, tomorrow He can just change the rules on morality. And Jews and Christians don't agree with that. Why? Because His moral law is fixed perfectly in Himself, and that's never going to change because God's character is never going to change. In fact, God can't change the laws because then, you see, He is the judge, and now if He just changed the moral law on Himself as the bridegroom of His people, He'd be violating covenant. So that He as a covenant partner would be under God as creator. You following me? So this part is really important. So even God is under God. God, the covenant partner, is under God as creator. So that'll never change. And so here's a point I want to make. All violations against moral law aren't just breaking rules. If you have a violation against moral law, you know what you're doing? It's a violation, an offense against God Himself. This is why there's multiple places in the Bible when God says, if you oppress these people, you are doing it to me. If you do this to these little ones, you're doing it to me. He says it the other way around too. If you bless these little ones, you are blessing me. Why? Because the principle and his love for them, He calls Himself the Father of the fatherless and the protector of widows. And that principle is so sacrosanct that a violation is an offense and a violation against God Himself. And He will not forget. So you following me? The stakes are really serious business. And let me just say this one more part before we get to the latter portion of my sermon here. Neither doth Christ in the gospel any way dissolve, but much strengthens this obligation of the moral law. So some people think we're Christians, we can just ignore this Old Testament stuff. And, we're just free now, because we're all forgiven, it's all under grace. And some Christians then have this lax and lazy view of God's law. Because here are certain laws over here, and we don't do them anymore since, I guess, since we're all just forgetting if we kind of screw up, aren't we forgiven by Jesus anyway? But actually, when you read Jesus and listen to Him, He actually strengthens the moral law. Just a couple examples. If you hate, God, He says, you've been told that you're not supposed to murder anybody. But I tell you, if you hate your brother, you might as well have murdered him. So He took the fundamental moral law in the command against murder, and he intensified it. So if you think this question of like God wanting to protect, the weak and downtrodden, which is part of his moral law, if you think that Christians we're like, well, I don't think we have to do that now. I don't think that's true. Actually, it's exactly the opposite. It should be written on our hearts. The love for the widow and the fatherless and the vulnerable minority, we should allow that to be written on our hearts by the power of the Holy Spirit. And we should want to do it more and seek it even more because of Jesus. Now, let me just give you one more example before we close. I'll give you the most kind of famous example by which people attack the Bible today on this principle. They find all these laws in the Old Testament which people don't practice anymore, and then when they find something that Christians say, well, you're not supposed to do this, or you are supposed to do this, or you're not supposed to do this, and they don't like it, they find that offensive, then they find something to make the Bible seem ridiculous. And I've heard this attack on Christians again and again and again. So the one that is today is on the Bible's prohibition against homosexuality, which, by the way, is clearly taught in the New Testament and the Old Testament. So when you cite those verses, especially in the Old Testament, some clever person, sometimes they even call themselves Christians, say, well, we don't have to follow that anymore, because they want to just say, well, it's perfectly fine to live a homosexual lifestyle and then embrace something like gay marriage. So then they'll point to something like, hey, you see those laws that God said about mildew? So we don't do that anymore, so I don't think we need to worry about the homosexuality law anymore either. That's a particular example, by the way, that people today try to break the authority of God and then take some of those laws and then confuses people. So I taught this to you today. The stakes are very, very high. Nobody's going to argue about the kinsman redeemer law. Are we supposed to do that? The point I want to make to you is we're not going to follow the kinsman redeemer law the way they did back then, but the fundamental underlying principle of justice to protect the widow, we should do that. We should seriously find ways to do that, because that's part of the moral law. The kinsman redeemer law was part of the judicial law, but the moral law we follow. And so I want to give you this very powerful piece of theology to arm you and to see that the wisdom of the Bible is absolutely incredible. So if you hear these various, your kids will go to school and then they'll have lies being taught, and they may come home and actually say this to you, help you remember today's message, okay? Now let's close. Let's talk about Jesus. Christ's fulfillment once for all. And I thought the way I closed today's message was to go a couple chapters forward. I'll share it to you out of the book of Hebrews. Chapter 10, verse 1. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities. So here's what it means. They built all these things, the temple, they had a priest, they had a perfect lamb that would be slaughtered, that was supposed to pay for their sins, and they have all these different laws, and they're saying that they were actually intended to be like a shadow. Those things weren't the fundamental essence themselves. They were intended to take us to heavenly realities that would be forever. But back then, they were just the shadows, but now the true reality has come. That's what this passage is saying. Since the law is but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. How would you like to come before God and have 613 laws? And you're going, I sure hope I did them all. And you came before God and you know a lot of them you didn't do. A lot of them you violated. How'd you like to come before God like that? And the new covenant is saying, you don't have to do it that way. Because God fulfilled covenant for us through the new covenant. Verse 2. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? They would keep being offered these sacrifices, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of their sins. But in these sacrifices, there is actually a reminder of your sins every year. So these laws that they didn't make them holy and utterly acceptable before God. Actually, what they end up doing is they remind people that they fall short. Verse 4. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And I'm sure Israel, all throughout its history, knew that they were covenant failures and justice breakers. And they probably looked forward to that day when that lamb would be sacrificed in their stead to pay for their sins, so that they can feel that this covenant is not going to end. But actually, those bulls and lambs and goats could not do that. Verse 5. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, so they're saying this is how Jesus understands the whole Old Testament. Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as is written of me in the scroll of the book. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, these are offered according to the law. Verse 9, then he added, behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first, that is the first covenant, in order to establish the second. Who did away with the first? It was Jesus. And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. This is the gospel. It isn't just, there's this kind of truncated notion of how people think Christianity means. There's these rules, and if we break them, then we're sinners. We know that. But then Jesus paid for our sins, and then we get this get out of jail free card, and then we'll go to the good place. But it's not just a place. It was a covenant. You know what makes heaven heavenly? Because we are one with God. Because the covenant has been fulfilled. And that covenant, where two has become one, will never break. No matter how unjust we are, how selfish we are, how much we fall down. The new covenant, Jesus came because when the covenant needed the people to fulfill the covenant, it couldn't be fulfilled. So God sent one greater than Moses, greater than David, greater than Ruth. You know, we're in this incredible book. Ruth and Boaz are incredibly righteous and beautiful people. But it wasn't enough. God sent one who would fulfill covenant, who would do all of the righteousness, all of the law in our place, and he'd receive all of the curse for being covenant failures and justice breakers. That's the wild thing of it. He is the utter most beautiful justice keeper. We are the justice failures. But he came to unite himself to us through the new covenant, and with his blood on the cross, he came to fulfill covenant for us in the new covenant. Here's the way I want to close this message. If you have given your life to Jesus Christ, isn't that an incredible thing? That we don't really care about the poor, and our money is generally regularly for ourselves, and we don't even know how to pay attention when somebody is fatherless or a widow or a minority, and they're being downtrodden and terrible things are happening to them, and we mostly don't care. If you're really honest, that's the way we are, aren't we? That's how we are. And yet Jesus came to fulfill righteousness and justice in our place. And he did it so that not by fear, not by obligation, not just because you should just do it because you're supposed to do it because you're supposed to be a good Christian, like our sister Grace feared as she grew up in church, but because he has washed us. He has graced us. And if his grace is in us, should we want to do this less? Or should we not seek a repentance and want it more? So brothers and sisters, I want to ask you, would you ask the Lord to make you a more just person? And if you don't have that desire, you would want to love the widow and the fatherless and the vulnerable minority because of grace. Everything in Christianity is because of grace. And in our church, I don't know if you felt this in our church. Do you notice that we generally don't guilt you? We don't guilt you. We don't try to obligate you. And we certainly don't try to shame or motivate you by fear. You know why? Because that's not how Jesus did it for us. We really believe it's by grace because he's given us this new covenant. It'll be by grace through love forever and ever, unconditional and unbreakable. And so inside of that, would you find the freedom to want to obey, to want to become more just, to want to be united to Jesus? Let's pray. Lord, we're a confused people, and we're often so fixated on rules and laws, and we now live in a time where it just seems so schizophrenic. On the one hand, along with our culture, we want to cast off all rules and just think nobody can tell me what to do. And at the same time, in a post-Christian and secular culture, there seems to be more rules and more demands and more fear motivation and more guilt motivation and shame. And we are hit by the shame and guilt and rejection stick all the time. But that is not what you did for us. Though we are justice breakers and covenant failures, you came to succeed where we have failed. You came to wash us when our justice falls short. You came to unite yourself to us, to make us whole and beautiful like you. Cause us to be truly like you and to love you and to be beautiful and to walk in this world in a way that shines of beautiful and real and true justice, so that our neighbors in this unjust and broken city and times would see that you are true and you are alive. And there'll be many, like our sister Grace, who would find that you are filled with grace. Thank you for loving us this way. In Jesus' name, amen.